uh, grayish brown hair, more actually like brownish gray hair. I use the pronouns he and his, and I'm wearing a dark jacket. And I'm really happy to be here with you all tonight. I've been out talking about this book for a couple of months now. And a number of people in that process have come to me as I've been talking about FDR's experience with polio and talked about how meaningful their own experiences at the FDR Memorial were. And as someone who lived through the creation and can remember well the controversy around the FDR Memorial at its inception, it's really heartening to see that from people and see how much the FDR Memorial means to people all over this country. So it's really great to be here tonight. So why this book? So the book that I have written is actually not the book that I set out to write. I set out to write a biography of Franklin Roosevelt, which is, sort of maybe a foolhardy endeavor, because there have been more books written about FDR probably than any other president except Lincoln. But I wanted to look at FDR's life because I wanted to sort of ask a very simple, but it also felt like urgent question, which is, how does a president in a time of trouble, in a time of national trauma and crisis, inspire hope? Hope is a word that we hear a lot in our politics today, but we hear it so much that it's sort of lost meaning, but it's also something that we really need. We've lived through challenging times in this country in recent years. And FDR, I think, is about as good an example as we have in the presidency of a president who was able to form a bond with the people that he was charged with leading and convince them that they were going to be able to find their way out of difficult times and really look to a better future. And so I thought when I started out that book that I would just do the story of FDR's experience with polio in about half a chapter. I thought I sort of knew the polio story. I thought its significance was chiefly the efforts that FDR went to as president to conceal his disability from the public and the sort of code of silence that existed in the press. But as I really sort of dug into the research and trying to understand who Franklin Roosevelt was, I came to understand that the polio story was something altogether different. Polio was really the sort of source of a lot of the qualities that made FDR a transformative leader who was able to inspire hope in the country. And I found that from looking at the testimony of the people who knew him best. Eleanor Roosevelt talked about FDR's experience recovering from the effects of polio, and she said that it was what forced him to reckon with the fundamentals of living. Louis Howe, who was the Roosevelt's sort of closest political advisor in the 1920s, described how sort of FDR's wonderful capacity for empathy was really born in those years of his own recovery. It was the first time, Howe said, when Roosevelt was forced to think about the other fellow's point of view. And it was really actually looking at FDR's correspondence with other polio patients at the FDR library, reading letters that other polio patients wrote to FDR after FDR's diagnosis with polio was announced to the public in the fall of 1921. Other polio patients, people who had gone through the experience of recovering from polio, wrote him letters, and some of them were offering advice. I was particularly struck by one letter from a man who came from a very different circumstance from FDR. This was someone who'd been a railroad worker. He had gotten polio and was fully paralyzed, and he'd spent 7 years in a hospital. And he described how in that experience, sort of rage and fear and shame had impeded his recovery. And he said to FDR, he said, this is in a letter, he said, "Mr. Roosevelt, whatever you do, don't worry, it won't help any." And I read those words and I saw a direct line to the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. So I came to understand in that process that if we really want to understand how FDR was able to bring hope to the country, the best way to do it was to tell the story of how he found it in his own life.
Thank you. That's that beginning of talking about fear is something that is an ongoing thread that was through his presidency. So obviously major. Paul, I'd love to kick it over to you.
Thank you, Mary. I'm an incredibly handsome 68-year-old white male with light brown hair. I'm wearing a dark jacket and tie, and I go by he and him. And I just want to tell you, Jonathan, I think this is a fantastic book. You've done an excellent job of, really bringing a new perspective to this part of his story. And so my first question is going to start sort of at the beginning, which is your first chapter where it's called Precious Child, and talk about the life Franklin Roosevelt had as a child and this very sort of incredibly privileged life that he led, on the banks of the Hudson River, and how that laid a foundation for the rest of his life.
Thank you, Paul, and it's really an honor to be here with you tonight. So yeah, FDR was born in 1882 at his family home in Hyde Park, and I would say the hallmarks of his upbringing were extreme privilege, extreme isolation in a lot of ways. There weren't a lot of other children around. He was the only children of his mother and father's marriage. He had a much older half sibling, and extreme love from both of his parents. But the sort of guiding force in a lot of ways of his early life was his mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt. And Sarah Delano Roosevelt is one of these people who, had she been born in a later age, would have probably been, a CEO or a leader of the United Nations. I mean, she was a formidable presence, but she put a lot of that into raising her son Franklin, and she really wanted to be the sort of chief guide to her son's upbringing, which a lot of other women in her class at that period of time, they sort of didn't spend as much time with their children. They would have farmed it out to governesses or nannies or that sort of thing. Sarah Roosevelt really wanted to be involved. And I think she sort of prided herself on not having very many rules for Franklin Roosevelt's upbringing, but there was sort of one giant expectation which hung over his whole childhood, which was that he be pleasant at all times. And the sort of, first sign that he was causing unpleasantness in others was when he would get reprimanded by his mother. And I think that's really key to understanding Franklin Roosevelt in a lot of ways. It's the root of something you see throughout his life and in his presidency, where there's this sort of wall between him and what he's presenting to the outside world and whatever is going on in his inner life. One of his biographers, his former speechwriter, Robert Sherwood, described it as his heavily forested interior. It's this idea that what's really going on in FDR's head is not something that's easy to access. I think that has its roots in his childhood. And it gives him this sort of wonderful ability to get along with people and to be sort of optimistic and pleasant to be around. But there isn't in his childhood an experience that sort of forces him to get out of his comfort zone and sort of develop greater depth of character. That's really not going to come, I believe, until he gets polio at the age of 39.
Let's talk about his education for a moment, because he was not, other than in the eyes of his mother, he was not an exceptional child. He went to Groton and to Harvard and really didn't distinguish himself. And part of that, I think, was this isolation he'd had growing up. Talk about how those formative years, particularly his relationship with Endicott Peabody, the headmaster at Groton, and how that influenced him in those formative years from 14 to 22.
That's right. I mean, he went to Groton later than a lot of kids, and he was sort of slow to mature. And he really hadn't spent a lot of time around other children. So he got to Groton, and he was actually bullied by kids. And he wasn't really adept at forming a connection with people. And even when he went to college at Harvard, he sort of tried a little too hard. He was someone who sort of seemed to really like the sound of his own voice and really wanted to sort of, prove how great he was all the time. And that was in an era where his peers at Harvard were sort of cool and disaffected. So he didn't completely sort of distinguish himself. He was described by some women at the time as a feather duster. And so, he didn't have that sort of wonderful charm that we associate with FDR. It wasn't sort of keyed into what people wanted to see from him in those years. And he really had a lot to learn, and that extended even into his early political career.
Yeah. So his big accomplishment at Harvard was becoming the editor of the Crimson, the newspaper there. It was one of the few ways he was able to contribute. And he would later brag to reporters, "Oh, I was a journalist once as well." So you have an interesting title for the chapter, the Meeting the Orphan Girl, about his relationship with his distant cousin, Eleanor Roosevelt. I've always thought that this is the critical transition moment for FDR as he transitions from essentially a child to a man. Talk about what attracted him to her and what attracted her to him.
There were a number of things. Eleanor Roosevelt, who was his distant cousin, was at that stage, she was someone who she was 2 years younger than him. She had just returned from this education in Europe at a school run by a woman named Marie Souvestre, which was this sort of broad intellectual awakening for her. So when Franklin sort of fell in love with her, he'd known her as a child. A lot of people, they'll say about someone, "Oh, I've known them longer than I can remember." For Franklin and Eleanor, that was literally true. They knew each other as small children, but it was only when they reconnected as young adults that he fell in love with her and saw her as a potential romantic match. And certainly it was her intellect and her sort of sophistication in conversation. But also I think there was one other factor which was sort of in the mix, which was she was the niece of Teddy Roosevelt, who at that period in time was the president of the United States, and he was Franklin Roosevelt's sort of idol and the person that he wanted to be. Franklin Roosevelt, during his college years, sort of set his sights on the idea of being the next Teddy Roosevelt. So a romantic connection to his cousin Eleanor was a way to get himself very closely into Teddy Roosevelt's circle. That wasn't necessarily what, consciously drove Franklin to Eleanor, but it was sort of in the mix as one of the things that made her attractive. And I think in a lot of ways, when you look at their marriage and their romantic connection in those early years, on paper, they seem like a great match. They are, members of the same family. They sort of have all the same customs. They know a lot of the same people. But if you dig down deep into it, the sort of emotional upbringing that they had each had was entirely different. If the sort of great characteristic of Franklin Roosevelt's early life had been this sort of immense love that came from his mother and father, Eleanor Roosevelt's early life was marked by sort of constant trauma and in a lot of ways, the absence of love. By the time she was 8 years old, she lost both of her parents, and she had this sort of difficult itinerant upbringing. And I think that they both take away from that a very different understanding of what love is. Franklin gets from his upbringing this idea that love is this infinite quantity, and the more of it you give to the world, the more of it you get in return. And Eleanor had this idea that love is this thing that you have to hold on to tightly because you don't know when it's going to run out. And that I think causes some misunderstanding in their relationship that's really going to cause trouble in the early years of their marriage.
Yeah, the Teddy presided over their wedding. He gave Eleanor away and ended up overshadowing the bride and groom. And as Teddy's daughter Alice famously said, he was the baby at every christening, the groom at every wedding, and the corpse at every funeral. We're going to jump ahead here. We're going to skip over his professional years and his years in Albany in the state legislature and go right to one of the key transitions for him in following Teddy's footsteps, which was he had supported Woodrow Wilson in the presidential election in 1912 against Teddy. And when Woodrow Wilson became president, he appointed FDR to become the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a position that Teddy Roosevelt had earned. They moved to Washington. This is a major transition and an important milestone, but very difficult for Eleanor. Talk a little bit about what that Washington experience was and why being Assistant Secretary of the Navy was so important to Franklin.
Yeah, this is a moment where you see Franklin and Eleanor's paths really diverge in a lot of ways. They do move to Washington in the Wilson administration when Franklin gets the position as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And he views that as the best thing that could happen to him, because his goal, again, is to sort of follow exactly the path that Teddy Roosevelt had followed to the White House. And that job, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, was the job that Teddy Roosevelt had when he really became a national phenomenon at the outset of the Spanish-American War. And Franklin gets to Washington and he loves it. It's the first time in his life after that sort of troubled experience at Groton and at Harvard. It's the first time in his life where his sort of self-image matches the response he gets from other people. People love having this sort of energetic Roosevelt around who's doing a Teddy Roosevelt impersonation. He figures out very early on that journalists, which is a group to which I belong, can be somewhat lazy. And if you give them a storyline that's a good story, they'll probably run with it. So the story that he gives to the press is, here's the next incarnation of Teddy Roosevelt. He starts using the word bully a lot in conversation. And it's all with this sort of wink. So it's a sort of wonderful period in Franklin Roosevelt's life. It's a period in Eleanor Roosevelt's life that's really the beginning of a crisis in a lot of ways. She and Franklin together had 6 children, 5 of whom survived ultimately into adulthood. And her children were getting older. And she didn't really have a good sense of how to be, in the parlance of the time, a Washington wife. She was uncomfortable with the sort of semi-public role that involved. And what really brought about a crisis in her life and in their marriage was an affair, a famous affair that Franklin had with Eleanor's social secretary, Lucy Mercer, which was not only a betrayal in their marriage, it was a sort of prolonged public humiliation of Eleanor Roosevelt in Washington that lasted into the later years of the Woodrow Wilson presidency, which is actually where my book begins. And I think that's sort of, such an interesting moment for Eleanor, because and it's where she starts in my book, and you see her really at a low point where she doesn't really know who she is or what she wants to do with her life.
Yeah, it's a trauma for Eleanor. She offers a divorce to Franklin, and Franklin seriously considers it because he thinks of Lucy, as the love of his life. And his advisor, Louis Howe, and his mother, Sarah, both basically say, you can't do this, you have to break it off. Lucy's story goes on for decades, and we'll have to sort of skip that because we get into this transition here when Wilson, in the 1920 presidential election, Wilson has become quite ill, and FDR now has a new opportunity politically to run as the vice president on a Democratic ticket. And again, this is elevating him. Teddy Roosevelt had run as vice president. Talk about that transition and how it elevated him to a whole new level of national recognition.
Yeah. So in the 1920 presidential race, the Democratic Party in that era was quite divided. There was a sort of Wilsonian wing that was associated with Woodrow Wilson, the incumbent president who was not seeking another term. And then there were, and that was rooted in the South, which was a major base of the Democratic Party in those days. But there was also this sort of emerging bloc in the Democratic Party, which was voters in big cities, recent immigrants to the United States, minorities. And New York State, because of the influence of New York City, was a sort of a beating heart of that. And Franklin Roosevelt is someone who on paper sort of is able to check both of those boxes. He has these Woodrow Wilson credentials because of his years serving as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, but he came from New York State, which was the largest state in the country at that point and the sort of biggest electoral prize. So he goes to the 1920 Democratic Convention, sort of hoping that that mix will help him. And he really, and I think this is where you see who the sort of pre-polio FDR was in a lot of ways. He tries to make a big splash at that convention, and it's all based on these sort of superficial and somewhat shallow things. He was sort of projecting his height. He was tall, he was very handsome. And his athleticism, he made a big splash, sort of running around on the floor of the convention, like leaping over chairs and stealing the standard of New York State and getting into physical fights. And it's all about making this physical impression as someone who looks like a dashing young man in a hurry. And it's enough to really get him ultimately onto the Democratic ticket in 1920. And that's a person that I thought about a lot in writing this book, is that pre-polio FDR. And that person, had he never gotten polio, he might have, if sort of, the stars had aligned, he might have ended up in the presidency someday. But in my view, he never would have been a great president because he hadn't gone through the experience that was going to teach him all that he needed to learn.
All right, let's jump right to the heart of your book, which is the Democrats are defeated in the 1920 presidential election. Roosevelt sort of goes into this brief period of working the legal system, getting a well-paying job and trying to build his networks. And he goes up to the family home in Campobello Island in the Bay of Fundy, just north of Maine, to meet his family for a summer vacation. And something happened which changes his life and really changes the history of the world.
That's right. It was an August day in 1921. He was 39 years old, and he was just a year out from that moment running as the vice presidential candidate. And really, it happens in the period of a day or two. He goes to bed one night experiencing sort of flu-like symptoms, and he wakes up in the morning and he has a hard time supporting himself on 2 feet. And within a day of that, he had lost the ability to walk, and he was never going to walk again unaided in his life. They were on Campobello, which was this tiny island, Canadian island, off of the coast of Maine, which was about as bad a place as you could be at that in the summer of 1921 if you were suddenly overtaken with a serious illness. The house didn't have electricity, it was gaslit. There was only one phone line on the island. The sort of medical needs of the island were provided by a doctor from a nearby community who arrived by boat. And when Franklin Roosevelt, who's a well-known figure on Campobello, takes seriously ill, no one really understands exactly what's happening to him as he's experiencing these extreme symptoms of what we now understand was the progression of polio. But it takes a sort of long, dramatic interlude of 2.5 weeks before he is adequately diagnosed with what was known at the time as colloquially as infantile paralysis or polio. And getting that diagnosis in the summer of 1921 was about as terrifying a diagnosis as you could get. Polio had been around for quite some time at that point, but it was only since the early years of the 20th century that it had really become this source of universal fear in the United States because of these epidemics that had happened in American cities. There had been an epidemic in New York City in 1916 that killed 2,000 people, many of them children. And, I sort of think about it in a lot of ways like the way that we felt about in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, where there's this sort of mix of extreme fear, but also mystery and uncertainty with people not understanding how the virus worked. In COVID, we can remember when we were all sort of washing our groceries in that phase. With polio, it was like that for decades. People knew that this was something that you had to fear, but they really understood very little about how it was transmitted, how it was best treated, and how you could encourage recovery from its effects. So when Franklin Roosevelt gets that diagnosis in the summer of 1921, he's getting this really, really quite sobering diagnosis of something that he understands right away is going to alter the course of his life from what he thought had been a very set plan.
You do a really excellent job of providing the dramatic narrative for this experience, how he gets back to New York, the doctors, the press, the internal process of trying to control the information. But the next couple of years are this very interesting period in the way you frame them, the way you structure them regarding the rest of his life. And there are certain things that he develops in his process of dealing with this trauma that become foundational. Could you talk about that? You can break out of the timeline a little bit because you do such a great job for the rest of the second half of the book on this, but talk about what was it specifically about his dealing with polio that helped him become such a great leader?
I think, I mentioned Louis Howe before, and I think that is in this sort of the timeline that we've been working on, he's such an integral figure at this point. Louis Howe was a political advisor who'd been in the Roosevelts' lives for a number of years, and he had early on set his eyes on the pre-polio Franklin Roosevelt as someone who could be a president of the United States. And most, we today sort of think of political consultants, political advisors as these deeply cynical human beings. And I think most of us think a political consultant who has a candidate that he's invested a lot of time in, and that candidate all of a sudden gets a diagnosis that's going to show that he's going to be having away from the political stage and literally off of his feet for quite some time. Most political consultants would start looking for another candidate. Louis Howe moved into the Roosevelt's house. He was that devoted to Franklin Roosevelt that he wanted to really take a direct role in helping FDR to recover from the effects of polio. And I think he understood, and there's a number of reasons why he understood this, but he understood that key to FDR's recovery was going to be having some vision of a hopeful and better future that lay ahead. And there were other people in Franklin Roosevelt's orbit, chiefly his mother, Sarah, who were sort of saying to him at that point, okay, it looks like you're going to be disabled, or as they put it at the time, you're going to be an invalid. Why don't you give up this dream of politics and sort of retire to Hyde Park and lead a comfortable life as a country squire? Louis Howe comes to Franklin Roosevelt in these years, in those first days, after the FDR comes home from the hospital in the fall of 1921, and he says to him, I not only believe you're going to return to politics, I believe you're going to be president of the United States, and I've got a detailed plan for how it's going to all happen. You're going to devote your life in the years ahead, chiefly to trying to regain as much of the ability to walk as you can. We're going to find other creative ways to keep your name in the public sphere while you're doing that work. Ultimately, you're going to run for governor of New York and then for president of the United States. And he presents this whole plan to Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt's response is, when do we start? And that's sort of the beginning of where you see this change in him that's really going to come about in these years where he has to, he understands that to make that plan work, he has to develop all sorts of gifts he'd never had before. He needs to sort of develop an oratorical presence that's going to compensate for that physical presence that had been so important in his early career. He needs to sort of find ways to rely on the people in his life and appreciate the contribution of the people in his life, like Louis Howe and like Eleanor, in a way that he had never appreciated them before. And then he ultimately is sort of awakened in these years to what suffering is really like. It stops being an abstract concept for him. And it becomes something that he understands on a practical level, and he thinks about what people who are going through hard times really need. And that develops this incredible capacity for empathy that's in him, and that's going to be so essential to his success as president.
Now, Mary, I don't know if you want to come in here for a second, because this is the period where the family and Louis Howe and everyone go to great lengths to hide the details of his condition. And everybody knew, it was front page of the New York Times, that he had contracted polio. And even when he was in public, they would see him walking in this sort of awkward manner, but they went to great lengths, working with the press and others, to conceal his true condition. And of course, this led to the family resisting the idea of him being in a wheelchair at the Memorial Park. Do you want to talk about this at all, or should we? I imagine you have something to say.
Oh, sure. Well, thank you. You know me well. Yes, I would love to. And that's why this, once I saw that this book came out, I told Jonathan how this summer I would, I would ride around my neighborhood and listen to his book. And it was, I knew how it would turn out, but I was still gripped by it. So that's how good of a read it was. Yeah, I'd love to get into that, teasing out the disability experience. And there's so much to say about it. If you could just, one of the things that kind of continues to confound me is this conversation that people will say, he hid it. He hid his disability. That's it. But it isn't that he just hid it. It was much more than that. Sometimes it was hidden. Sometimes it was downplayed. Sometimes it was open. Sometimes there was language used that I hadn't heard of before, language used that was purposefully disability related language. I can't remember who, I'm sure you'll know right away, but someone said, throw out the crutches that of some economic policy and referring to FDR. So help us all understand here in this year of 2023, you know, there isn't just one FDR, but help us understand truly him as a person who was disabled, and not have people think right away he was the guy who shunned being disabled.
I think it's a complicated and nuanced story in a lot of ways, because it's true on the one hand that he and his inner circle went to extraordinary lengths to conceal the extent of his disability from the public. And that was true from the earliest moments of his illness and recovery. So when his diagnosis with infantile paralysis was announced to the public in 1921, the article in the New York Times had a quote from FDR's doctor that said, "No one need have any fear of a permanent disability." And they knew at that point that that was not true, but they were willing to sort of be dishonest because they were afraid of the sort of perception that would be the end of his political career. And so throughout, even in the 1920s, they continue to go to these steps to sort of present always the rosiest picture possible. So a lot of there will be articles in these years about FDR's experience with polio and about his attempts at recovery from its effects. And it's always, he's always a couple of months away from walking on his own. And it's always sort of put in the best possible light. At the same time, and this is particularly true in the 1920s, if you were reading newspapers in the 1920s and you were interested in Franklin Roosevelt, you knew that he had polio, you knew that he had lost the ability to walk. You might have even seen pictures of him at Warm Springs that showed the really incredible effects that polio had had on his body. And I think something that's unique to his experience in the 1920s, when he ultimately re-enters the political arena which he does in 1928, running for governor of New York, polio is actually an important part of the story. They need a way to sort of, as we would put it today, humanize Franklin Roosevelt. And this sort of comeback story of this man who had this illness and was now sort of triumphing and returning to the political stage becomes a part of the conversation. It's also part of the conversation in those years because his political rivals, both in the 1928 governor's race and ultimately in the 1932 presidential race, are trying in sort of subtle and not so subtle ways to suggest that his disability makes him unfit for the presidency. In 1932, Al Smith, who was one of his rivals for the Democratic nomination for the presidency, a sort of disciple of Smith's, referred to FDR as a mental weakling. But the really important word there was weak. He wanted to sort of give this idea that he wasn't physically up to the job. And something that I found that was really interesting, this is another moment where I was really enlightened by looking at other polio patients from the time. There was an essay that a patient at FDR's Warm Springs wrote in the first days of FDR's presidency, where he sort of was grappling with this whole conversation about the new president's disability and this concept of weakness. And that person wrote, he said of, as he put it, able-bodied people, perhaps they fail to realize that the paralysis which has made us weaker animals has made us stronger men. And that's really, I think, that person got it. That is the heart of Franklin Roosevelt.
You do a great job of describing some of his daily routines in the book. And for people who haven't read it, you envision the fact that he can't get out of bed unaided. He can't go to the bathroom. He can't put his clothes on. He can't get in and out of his wheelchair. He can't get in and out of a car. He can't walk without holding on to someone's arm and having a cane or a crutch. So every moment of his day, he is confronted with being differently abled. And yet everybody describes the same way. He's always happy. He always is having this light banter with the people who are helping him. And when people, when he's being carried or something, he'll always wave and ask about your wife or your kids. And it was as Rob John said earlier, there's two levels. There's the superficial level and there's the inner level. But that ability to project, and you really do describe this well, is a direct result of his experience with polio. And it created this almost superhuman character where, despite his condition, he never let on that he was discomforted in any way whatsoever.
That's right. And something else that I found really enlightening is he was as you know well, Paul, he was so comfortable being himself in every sense around other polio patients at Warm Springs, which was this place in Georgia that he really played this incredible role in turning into a rehabilitative colony for other paralysis sufferers. He was able to form a connection with people there, and he really was able to take tremendous pride and ownership in other people's recovery. So I would, look at medical reports that were written about Warm Springs patients in the 1920s, where you would see sort of this patient arrived here and this muscle was this size, now it's this size. He was only able to walk this far, now unaided, now he's able to walk this far. And then down at the bottom of the report, the person who had written that medical report signed his name, and it was Franklin D. Roosevelt. So he's really, that involved on that level in the 1920s. And I think that the miracle of Warm Springs in a lot of ways is its ability to unlock his sort of sense of his own ability to help other people, which he's then going to carry on into the presidency in a much bigger stage.
Now we're running out of time, so I'm going to jump ahead for a second and then come back to a question. But many people don't know this, that FDR raised millions of dollars to transform this Warm Springs, this rundown resort in Georgia, into the preeminent polio rehabilitation center in the world, and eventually formed a foundation called the March of Dimes. And 10 years after FDR died, the March of Dimes funded the research that directly led to the first polio vaccine. So FDR's efforts in this area actually cured polio. It's rather incredible. It's a different story, but so to go back now, one of your major points that I thought was so vital is this idea that he would listen to experts who would tell him things about his polio, but he would decide which he was going to believe and which he was not going to believe and what he was going to do. And he would sort of synthesize these different recommendations. And he does the same thing when he becomes president, whether it's about economic policy or about the war. Talk about that, because I thought you summarized that better than anything I've ever read before.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was something that really occurred to me is how much the sort of lessons of his search for recovery inform his approach to the presidency. And a sort of essential principle is he learns this in the early years of his recovery, that he's in a position to gather the best advice. He was a privileged person who knew a lot of people, so he was able to get the best sort of wisdom that was around medically about what you could do to encourage recovery and recover from the effects of polio. And he tried a lot of it, but then he understood at a certain point that he, in a lot of ways, knew more than some of the doctors that he was talking to, because he was facing this reality on a daily basis. And that gives him this confidence to sort of pick and choose. And I saw in that the sort of, as you say, the sort of hallmarks of the Roosevelt presidency. I think a lot of people today think of, because of the New Deal is so associated with the left, they think of Franklin Roosevelt as being this sort of doctrinaire, ideological person. But really, the New Deal was in a lot of ways about experimentation and empirical pursuits, this idea that the country was facing this tremendous challenges and that they needed to do as much as they can and try as many different things. FDR famously in his speech where he introduces the idea of the New Deal says, above all, try something. And that was the sort of guiding principle of his recovery, was try something. And if it fails, admit it plainly, but above all, try something.
Yeah, and try something else. So Mary, how are we for time? What's our next step here?
Well, thanks. We have a bunch of questions, and so I'm going to ask Kelly to share them.
Wonderful. Yes. So the first question will probably be a short answer, but Michael would like to know if you have any book tour events happening in Georgia.
I do not. In the near future, I did an event at the Atlanta History Center, which you can find online, and I'm going to be in Charleston, South Carolina next week. So depending on what part of Georgia you're in, but not too near to Warm Springs anytime soon, unfortunately.
Okay, perfect. The next question comes from Jack, and it's, did FDR lower his guard at Warm Springs as suggested in the Ken Burns special, letting people call him Rosie?
Yeah, letting people call him Rosie. Yeah, I mean, I think he was just generally, he was this presence at Warm Springs that was, even when he wasn't there, he was a sort of guiding presence of the place. He was particularly in the years where he's restarting his political career, he had really designed the experience at Warm Springs based around a lot of principles that he had sort of developed from his own recovery. And that's sort of about focusing on dignity. He knew this experience as someone who had a disability, that a good treatment for polio was going to warm water baths. But that some of these pools that you would go to, there was disabled people would have difficulty because they had to change or be changed in front of other people. So FDR puts a lot of thought into, let's have really nice private changing rooms at Warm Springs, which seems like a small thing, but I think it really focuses on this concept of, deliver dignity right away. You can't deliver complete recovery, but you can deliver dignity right away. And that, I think, is also a hallmark of the New Deal. It's why he was so sort of energized by projects like the Civilian Conservation Corps, which sort of get people to work and encourage a sense of purpose and usefulness. That's that sort of idea of delivering dignity. And he also did things at Warm Springs to encourage community. When he got there originally, there were a lot of cottages and they were all sort of dispersed, and there was nothing that encouraged patients there to commune with one another. FDR sort of had this vision of, let's connect all of the cottages with walkways that wheelchairs can go on, and we'll have a communal dining room that's going to become the sort of heart of the place. And he understood that that was so important to recovery, was to have those connections with other people who had gone through similar experiences. And that too, I think, is a central tenet of the New Deal, is let's find ways to sort of spiritually ennoble the American population by encouraging a sense of participation in something greater than just oneself. So you know, FDR is just he's a very, on the one hand, sort of casual, as you say, presence at Warm Springs, but he's also the sort of guiding spiritual purpose of the spiritual principle of the whole place.
Wonderful. So our next question comes from Shelton, and he is wondering how FDR prepared for his fireside chats and what amount of recovery time did he need to take after those chats for both mental and physical healing.
He didn't show a lot of signs of strain with something like delivering a speech over the radio. I think people who encountered him, particularly in the early years of his post-polio political career and his presidency, were amazed by the sort of ease with which he was able to do things. He could sort of ingest a lot of information without sort of appearing to put a lot of effort into it. But I think that there was the fireside chats are this side of FDR as performer, which really got developed in the polio years. He understood that he couldn't be this physical presence on a stage in the way that he had been before, but it was also coincided with the sort of proliferation of radio in the United States. The first news broadcast on the radio was someone just delivering the results of the 1920 election, in which Franklin Roosevelt had been the vice presidential candidate, into a radio microphone. And the next 10 years, which are the years that FDR's life is chiefly devoted to rehabilitation and recovery, are the years where radio takes over American life. And FDR was paying a lot of attention to that, and that's what sort of makes him, in a lot of ways, such a formidable radio performer. And I think even when you look at the fireside chats, I see someone who has had the experience of being a patient. Because the fireside chats, we think of them today as sort of great classic American oratory, but they're not soaring at oratory. They are detailed and in a certain sense, almost dense. And I think that's because he understood that when you are going through a great challenge, you want the details. You want the person who's talking to you to prove to you that they are credible and that they see the path forward. That's what he had wanted in his experience of illness, and that sort of guided him in the construction of the fireside chats.
If I can add an addition to the question, the fireside chats were not particularly physically strenuous because they mostly happened in the White House or at Hyde Park, and he was seated, he was comfortable, but the physical exertion involved in his public speaking was extraordinary because he had to wear steel braces. It was very painful for him to stand for extended periods of time, walking out to a podium in front of tens of thousands of people, preparing for those speeches. And he had to hold himself up despite his braces while he's talking, or he had to lean with his hips against the podium if he was going to use both hands. And he would often be drenched in sweat at the end of these speeches because they were so physically taxing. And yet never once did his voice quaver? Did he show any sign of weakness? So it wasn't the fireside chats that were physically and sometimes emotionally draining. It were these public spectacles that he did where he knew that thousands of people were watching him, and the slightest failure would be front page news.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
Just a thought on that. on the fireside chat, anyone who has spent time in rehabilitation, anybody who's spent time in a hospital, anybody who has spent time just being chronically ill knows how important it is to have someone spend time with them and talk with them. And so I think, as someone who, that just resonated with me. That idea of the fireside chat. And I think somebody who went through what he went through had an intimate understanding of what it meant to have somebody take the time to talk with them and understand what others are going through. So it shocks me always when I keep getting, you get these amazing moments of connection to FDR and Eleanor. And I guess the last, before we sign off here, because we are at 8, but I can't help but point to, I think one of the greatest lines I've read in a really long time, which was a quote from Lewis Howe, which is, "A year or two in bed should be prescribed for all our statesmen." And that is included in your book, Jonathan. So maybe in a moment of levity, as we close this out, if you could just comment on your discovery of that quote and what that means for Roosevelt and what it means for today.
Yeah, I mean, I love that quote from Louis Howe. It's the quote that I use along with a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt at the beginning of my book. And I always say that, I'm sure a lot of us could think of a number of politicians today that could use a year or two in bed, or maybe a little longer. But I think it really gets to what makes this story so unique. Is it's a moment in FDR's life that looks quiet compared to the sort of great drama of the Depression and World War II. These are years that are, I think, conventionally thought of as private years of his life, but they are in those, what Howe understood was that in that experience of lying in bed and having to sort of contemplate his new reality and his new path forward, that FDR experienced dramatic growth that made him into a different human being. And I think that's inspiring and also instructive for all of us today.
Definitely. Well, I want to thank you, Jonathan, so much for spending time with us and preparing for this, and Paul Sparrow also for joining in helping to moderate this. Kelly, I'm going to let you close it out, but thank you all.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So on behalf of the FDR Memorial Legacy Committee, we just want to thank all of you for participating this evening in this discussion. When you close out, you will see a short survey from us immediately following the webinar, and we ask that you fill that out. And for more information, please visit our website. As I said before, this recording will be live on our website so that you can access it again. We encourage you to donate by texting FDR to 202-858-1233, and I have placed that information in the chat box, as well as a link to purchase Jonathan's book if you have yet to do so. So thank you again, and we hope you all have a wonderful evening.